The practice was simple. Give thousands of Moldovans 100 or 50 euro each and tell them to vote for a designated candidate. This was oligarch Ilan Shor's plan, and there are many indicators that it was also Russia's plan. The goal? To get rid of Moldova's pro-Western president. However, the plan failed, despite bribing up to 10% of voters. Maia Sandu won the elections, but the most important clash for Moldova's future will take place this year in the parliamentary elections. Will Russia try to take over Moldova? The ideal scenario for them is a repeat of the Georgian scenario, instigating a government loyal to the Kremlin and gradually distancing the country from the West. This video will be about Moldova, about how and why Russia wants to gain control of this country, and what the Moldovans themselves want. Do they want to be part of Europe? And why do some of them still, today, feel linked to Russia? But first, we need to talk about history. The Moldovans are a Romance-speaking nation, and their ethnicity is practically identical to the Romanians. So why the Russian presence in Moldova? Here we have to go back to 1812. As a result of the Turkish-Russian War, the Russians occupied Bessarabia, which is mostly the territory of today's Moldova. It was then that the policy of separating Moldovans from Romanians began. It was around that time that the Moldovan language, or simply Romanian written in Cyrillic, began to emerge.
The Russian Empire invented a language saying that you don't speak Romanian, you speak Moldovan. It's the same Romanian language, but written with Russian letters, which is absolutely insane. When we speak with our Romanian neighbors, we don't need any translator.
In addition, the Russian Empire pursued a policy of Russification in the area. To this end, at least, they settled ethnic Russians and other Russian-speaking nations and gave them numerous privileges. The situation changed after the Russian Revolution. Eventually, most of Moldova united with Romania, and Moldova was part of that country, until 1940. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is well known from history. It split Europe in two, and at that time, Bessarabia, or today's Moldova, ended up in the Soviet sphere of influence, while Romania found itself in the German zone of influence. After the end of World War II, Moldova became part of the USSR. Romania, despite being in the sphere of Soviet influence, remained a separate state. After the collapse of the USSR and the Yanayev Putsch, an independent Moldova was established. And many people believed it had been created just so it could soon join Romania.
The Moldovan independence movement, which had been developing since the late 1980s, was largely dominated by people close to pan-Romanism ideology. In other words, they considered themselves to be Romanians, and they recognized that Moldovans, ethnic Moldovans, were in fact Romanians, and that Moldova, without Transnistria, was historically part of Romania and therefore should be reunited. This was not a view shared by all members of the independence movement, but I think it can be considered the dominant one. In general, the idea of those who dominated the social and political life of the new republic at that time was the idea of reunification with Romania, that gaining independence was only a certain step towards this larger plan, which was precisely Romanian-Moldovan reunification.
However, pro-Romanian tendencies did not please everyone. Russification, which had lasted for decades, had its effects. Pro-Russian regions demanded bilingualism and equal status for the Russian language. As a result of the events of the 1990s, two territories with special status were created within Moldova. One is a fairly well-known but unrecognized state, Transnistria. The other is Gagauzia, autonomous from Moldova, and we will focus on it first. These are the streets of Gagauzia. The indigenous population of the area, the Gagauz, are an Orthodox Turkic-speaking people. The region has an autonomy status since the early 1990s. Its characteristic feature is the pro-Russian nature of the residents, and it's visible even after a short walk through the territory of Gagauzia.
That the Gagauz autonomy appeared not as a result of the movement of the Gagauz community for its language and culture. But as a result of great fear of the Gagauz community, because of the processes, tectonic processes that were taking place end of 80s, in the beginning of 90s, of the collapse of the Soviet Union. People got afraid, people got scared about it, and the National Front was becoming popular in Chisinau, and the pro-Romanian, pro-unification, reunification with Romania voices were louder and louder, and Russia and KGB played it very well here. So accelerating this fear, and people went to the streets to protect not Gagauz language, but protect their status quo of Russian-speaking region.
Let's reiterate. The autonomous territorial unit of Gagauzia was not created to protect Gagauz distinctiveness. It was created to keep Gagauzia close to Russia and, above all, to keep Moldova away from a rapprochement with Romania and the West. This was the case in the 1990s, and it is still the case today.
Gagauzia and Transnistria work as an anchor of Moldovan's totality, which means that actually anchor that keeps Moldova from drifting towards the European Union. So that's how the Gagauz community, Gagauz political class perceives Gagauzia, not as a separate entity, but as a part of Republic of Moldova, which keeps and prevents Republic of Moldova from going towards the European Union and remaining under the influence of the Russian Federation.
This is happening with the support of the people there. Let's look at the results of a recent referendum. It asked whether the aspiration for European Union membership should be written into the Moldovan constitution. In Gagauzia, as many as 95% of the region's population voted against it. Pro-Western President Maia Sandu received only 3% support in the runoff of the election.
The results of the elections and referendum in Gagauzia came as no surprise. Gagauzia has traditionally been a very pro-Russian region, reluctant to integrate with the European Union. Its residents believe that integration with the European Union is actually a step towards reunification with Romania, something that the Gagauz vehemently oppose. Besides, the Gagauz, who are under the influence of very intense Russian propaganda, consider the European Union to be, colloquially speaking, a hotbed of all evil and corruption. An organization that combats traditional values, is against Christianity, especially the Orthodox Church, which for the Gagauz is very important from the point of view of their identity. And Maia Sandu is really the epitome of European integration, the personification of this European model of development, and at the same time she is a politician who is openly, from the perspective of the Gagauz, anti-Russian, opposed to Putin. This is also a problem because, again, the Gagauz consider Russia to be a country not only close to them culturally and politically, they not only consider themselves part of the Russian world, the so-called Ruski Mir, but also consider Russia to be their main defender and protector, a country that is able to secure Moldovan independence from Romania and prevent the reunification of Romania and Moldova.
Russia's actions are extremely effective. Russia is not investing in Gagauzia and its development. It's investing in its political class. It is the European Union that is helping to develop the region. This road to Gagauzia is an example of it. It was built with the support of EU funds. Investments built with Russian money in Gagauzia are impossible to find.
We need to understand that the Russia not investing in Gagauz community, Russia investing in politicians, Russia investing in opinion makers. Yeah? So Russia is 100,000 kilometers from our border. We don't have any border with Russia. Russia was closing economic relations with Moldova slowly but surely. Russia was closing, not us were closing. Yeah? But still, people believe that Russia is the main strategic partner and main economic partner. I mean, and you look at the people with the higher education as writing this bullshit, and you cannot believe in that. I mean, and there is a question why they're writing. Well, simply because they are paid. Yeah? Well, they can be also useful idiots, but I don't believe in useful idiots. I mean, they're definitely paid for that. And Russia is investing in opinion makers. Russia investing in politicians, actually buying politicians and buying opinion makers. And then in order to keep this feeling and perception that the Gagauz community is a besieged fortress, that Russia is the only country that helps Gagauzia, that will protect Gagauzia, and the Kishinev and the rest of the world are enemies for Gagauzia that want to destroy Gagauzia.
Gagauzi generalnie uznają się za część Ruskawa Mira, rosyjskiego świata. Ich językiem...
Gagauz people generally consider themselves part of the Ruski Mir, so of the Russian world. Their everyday language is Russian. They are immersed in Russian culture, they follow the Russian media, and many Gagauz, even in recent years before the outbreak of the full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war, traveled to Russia for work. They simply consider themselves a nation culturally and linguistically close to Russia. And at the same time, they consider Russia to be their protector, being able to guarantee Moldova's independence and ensure that the country does not merge with Romania. In the memory of the Gagauz, Romania is not remembered fondly. Romanians are remembered for what they did on the territory of today's Moldova, including in Gagauzia. In the interwar period, Romania is remembered as a country that treated minorities badly, including the Gagauz minority. There is such a term, a symbolic one even, of the Romanian gendarme who was present during the interwar period, beat people in the street for not speaking Romanian, for speaking the local language, and so on. This is largely where this sympathy for Russia comes from. Of course, this is also the result of many years of Soviet propaganda, and now Russian propaganda, which has instilled in Gagauzians this very image of Russia. This is paradoxical because Russia, in fact, or rather the Soviet Union, was responsible in Moldova for the famine that took place in Moldova immediately after the war. Primarily, its casualties were among the Gagauz population in the south of today's Moldova. But this is what Gagauzians no longer remember.
This is an excerpt from Gagauz television during the celebrations of Victory Day. The reporter is asking why it's so important to celebrate this day. Because it's important to remember who won this victory for us. European Day is certainly a good thing, but there probably wouldn't be any Europe without this victory. And that's why it's important not to forget those to whom we owe this victory to. We will see the symptoms of Nazism. We already see them here. Do you know about the nightly torchlit marches, what happened in Odessa? Unfortunately, Europe pays no attention to this at all. That's why we're meeting here, to remind the younger generation that this is wrong. That's why we should constantly tell them about it, so that this doesn't ever happen again. So is Gagauzia separatist? The answer to this question is not at all obvious.
In Gagauzia, people also understand that they actually will not survive as a separate entity. That's why the idea of Gagauz separatism is not popular here. And Gagauz community, that's why does not care about its own language, its own identity, but cares about being pro-Russian and having possibility to speak Russian language here in the Republic of Moldova. Sometimes you get an impression that the Gagauz community wanted to stop alone, Gagauz community alone, together with Transnistria, wanted to stop the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah? So we are the last pieces of the Soviet Union on earth, maybe, yeah? Including Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So from the political point of view, Gagauzia, yes, it's a piece of the Soviet Union. Transnistria, not only the political piece, but also the economic and other spheres of life also remained in the Soviet Union. Here, economically and socially, we changed. But politically, yeah, Gagauz community is still in the Soviet Union. And this Gagauz community, Gagauz autonomy is about keeping the peace of Russian world here in the Republic of Moldova, but not about Gagauz community, Gagauz language and Gagauz culture.
We've mentioned Transnistria, and here a brief reminder. Transnistria is an unrecognized state. It was created as a result of the 1991-1992 war in Moldova. Pro-Russian Transnistrians opposed Moldova's nationalist tendencies and the country's departure from the Kremlin's sphere of influence. In the conflict with forces loyal to Chisinau, Transnistria was supported by Russia, but the clash was not at all about the territory of today's Transnistria.
The conflict over Transnistria is an element of the Russian aggression as a result of the dissolution of the USSR. This is how Russia wanted to gain control over all of Moldova.
To this day, Russian troops are still stationed on the territory of Transnistria. For Russia, Transnistria, like Gagauzia, is an anchor to keep Moldova out of the West. Paradoxically, even the Kremlin doesn't recognize Transnistria as a separate state.
Rosja nie uznaje Naddniestrza, ponieważ Naddniestrze...
Russia does not recognize Transnistria because it needs it precisely as part of Moldova. Paradoxically, Russia has consistently called for years for Transnistria to become a de facto part of Moldova again, but on terms that Russia would like. Russia has long proposed a federalization solution. It would like Transnistria as a subject of a federation with Moldova proper, perhaps still with Gagauzia, to be able to co-determine policy, first and foremost Moldova's foreign policy. The idea is simple, that Transnistria and the Federation Council, a joint parliament, should have veto power over key geopolitical decisions. In short, if Chisinau wanted to join the European Union, Transnistria as a federal entity could say no. If Gagauzia were also part of the federation, it too would likely say no. And this is why Russia does not recognize Transnistria. Because if Transnistria were recognized by Russia, it would be difficult for Russia to argue that it actually wants to bring about the reunification of Transnistria with Moldova proper.
Russia doesn't need Gagauzia as a separate entity, neither Transnistria as a separate entity. Russia needs the entire Republic of Moldova, the same like Russia needs entire Ukraine, not only part of Ukraine, right? And that's why Russia will never stop war in Ukraine until Ukraine stops it with the strong military operations, yeah? So until Ukraine remains weak and very good peace for invasion, Russia will continue to try to invade Ukraine. Same with the Republic of Moldova. They didn't recognize Transnistria like they did with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, for example, because they don't need Transnistria as a separate entity. They need the entire Republic of Moldova. Same with Gagauzia. And they need Gagauzia as a part of Republic of Moldova to destabilize the Republic of Moldova from inside.
Since Russia is not concerned with either Gagauzia or Transnistria, but with all of Moldova, it's time to discuss what exactly Russia wants to achieve and how it plans to do so. Our speakers, Moldovan experts, agree. Russia cannot allow Moldova to move towards the West.
I think that the biggest, the most important thing they're interested in is not allowing Moldova to become a stable European country, and even more not allowing the society being already entrenched in that European values or that European movement.
The origins of this Russian policy can be tracked back to the 1990s. These are the provisions of the first foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation. It was signed by Boris Yeltsin in 1993. The document reads, "Eastern Europe is important for Russia not only as a historical zone of interest. It is our current strategic task to counteract the transformation of Eastern Europe into a specific buffer zone, isolating us from Europe. And at the same time, we cannot allow Russia to be ousted by Western countries from the Eastern European region, which seems to be a real threat."
So intermediate goal, exactly as it's statuted by this Primakov doctrine, is to not allow these countries to distance from Russian influence. So this is the first very important stage, avoiding EU membership, very bad for them, NATO membership, independent political elites, economic independence from Russia, mental distance of the population from Russian, say, top narratives or strategic narratives. So like the self-perception as not being part of the Russian world, of their system of so-called values and priorities on the individual level, on the country level. Apart from it, strong institutions is something very bad for Russia, because a country with strong and independent justice, security services, army, of course, it's something very important for Russia. So keeping these countries, and this is, I think, the best example in this case is Moldova, is keeping the country weak, keeping the country in this gray zone, not controlled by Russia fully, but not integrated with the Western civilization too.
And how does Russia influence Moldova? One of its most powerful tools are oligarchs, such as Ilan Shor and Vlad Plahotniuk. In the past, they held important public positions. Today, they are trying to influence Moldovan politics from the back seat. And it's worth noting that both of them have numerous problems with the law and are not even present in Moldova.
Plahotniuk and Shor are the so-called Moldovan oligarchs. Their situation now varies. It is worth starting with Shor because he is the more active businessman and politician. He's living in Moscow now. From Moscow, he is in charge of several political parties operating in Moldova, parties with a pro-Russian, anti-government and anti-European profile. These parties are financed by Shor, partly from his own funds. It's worth remembering he was sentenced to many years in prison for his involvement in, or actually directing, the theft of $1 billion from the Moldovan banking sector in 2014. Shor is also backed by Russian oligarchs, most likely Abramovich. That's where he gets his money from. And he's pumping that money right into Moldovan politics, into the parties he leads, parties that are tasked with destabilizing the country, that are tasked with fighting the pro-European majority. And of course, if there were an option, parties that could take power. Vladimir Plahotniuk has been in hiding outside Moldova since 2019. He is also under investigation. This oligarch played a key role in Moldovan politics for very many years. He also has influence on some part of the political scene, much less than Ilan Shor, but there is no doubt that some of the politicians, judges, high-level officials are still in his sphere of influence, and perhaps even on his payroll, which he often uses to sabotage the process of European integration, the process of reform taking place in Moldova, for obvious reasons. Both Vladimir Plahotniuk and Ilan Shor would also like to return to Moldova at some point and continue the business they were involved in there.
A distinct part of the political landscape are the so-called Shor's babushkas.
If in Russia there are Putin's babushkas, then in our country there are Shor's babushkas. They regularly take part in protests, they get paid 400 lei each. It's all wonderfully organized.
This mechanism, meaning bribing citizens, is evident not only with the phenomenon of Shor's babushkas. This picture shows one of the stores of a chain that belongs to Ilan Shor.
The Mary Shor chain of stores, which has been operating for a very long time, are so-called social stores, where you can buy basic products, most often products such as flour, bread, milk, and so on, at really low prices, certainly lower than in most stores. These stores are subsidized precisely by Shor. They are used mainly by poor people, pensioners, people living in villages, because such stores are also found there, sometimes in a mobile version. Formally, these stores are not affiliated with Shor's party or parties, but they use symbolism similar to that used by Shor's groupings. Besides, the name of the Mary Shor stores themselves also refers to Shor's name. These stores are also used to collect information and create contact databases. For example, a person who wants to enjoy discounts must establish a loyalty card. Therefore, they have to provide information, a phone number and address. And this database of poor people who use these services is later used to, in the least, write, call or visit people before the elections and give them instructions on who they should vote for. Of course, since these people feel gratitude to Ilan Shor for offering them cheaper products, they can be expected to vote in Shor's interests.
Examples such as Shor's babushkas and his stores are very mundane, but there are more spectacular and simply dangerous examples. As we mentioned in the introduction to this video, during the last presidential election, a large portion of Moldovan voters were bribed. According to the Moldovan intelligence services, it was Ilan Shor and his Moscow handlers who were alleged to be behind this. This BBC excerpt explains the bribing mechanism. Will you tell me how much they were supposed to pay you? They said 1,000 rubles. For voting, right? Yes. Who promised that? A man. He left. He said he'd be back, but he still hasn't come. Who did you have to vote for? I don't want to say. What did he say exactly? How were you meant to vote in the referendum? They said they'd pay 500 rubles. Then here that man said 1,000. You came from Transnistria. Yes. And there are many of you who came here for the money? Me and her, and then another 3 people are meant to come. How were you meant to vote, or just take part? We voted for who they told us. I don't want to say who for. For the EU, was it yes or no? That's my business. I won't say.
Shor był w stanie
Shor was able to construct for himself a base of some 130,000 people, Moldovan voters who agreed to sell their votes in the elections and the referendum. They were tracked down, located, recruited precisely by the activists mentioned above, but also through bots that operated within Telegram, an app that is very popular in Moldova and which even older people have installed on their phones. They use it as an application to make phone calls, especially to relatives living abroad. 130,000 people is a huge scale for Moldova. Suffice it to say that all the voters in the first round of elections and the referendum in Moldova numbered about 1.5 million. So this is a little less than 10% of all the votes that were cast during that ballot. Shor, according to the Moldovan officials, was believed to have spent about 40 million euros on this to carry out these activities, to recruit these people and pay them to cast votes how he wanted.
As we mentioned, in Moldova, parties formed with the support of Moscow regularly emerge. Interestingly, however, they often pretend to be pro-European parties.
Even Russians, they understood that with a pro-Russian rhetoric you can never win the power in Moldova. So in order to get in the power, you need to play, to show off at least that you are pro-European. So that's why now our voters and the society should be much more attentive in detecting these fake pro-Europeans, because as I said, some of the political parties or political leaders are being financed by some Russian proxies only, to fill in the gap what they miss by financing only the pro-Europeans.
As our speaker said, yes, a straightforwardly pro-Russian narrative will not ensure winning elections. However, there are still people in the Moldovan electorate who are sincerely pro-Russian.
The polls that have been conducted over the last 2.5 years indicate that pro-Russian sentiment persists in a large part of the population and that even the war has unfortunately not changed this attitude.
Пророссийских настроений у достаточно большой части населения.
Prorosyjskie poglądy najpopularniejsze są wśród mniejszości.
Russian views are most popular among minorities living in Moldova. This includes both Slavic minorities, Russians, Ukrainians, Bulgarians, also Poles, but also, for example, Gagauz people, who are not Slavic, but are a Russian-speaking minority, because they use this language on a daily basis, which makes them more susceptible to Russian propaganda served in that language. They watch Russian media, including propaganda media, and as a result it builds this perception of reality in their mind. But not only that. This does not apply only to this type of people. We also have a certain group which is difficult to estimate, of ethnic Moldovans who are nevertheless pro-Russian. And here it is due to very different factors. Some are people who have various types of ties to Russia. They work there seasonally, for example, which was very popular in Moldova even before 2014. It is estimated that up to 500,000 Moldovans have worked in Russia. The country has a population of 2.4 million people. Some of these people simply have a kind of resentment towards Romania, if only because, again, they worked in Romania and there they experienced a kind of chauvinism on the part of Romanians. This unfortunately does happen. Romanians sometimes treat Moldovans as brothers, but poorer brothers, which makes some Moldovans simply feel downright humiliated, and this changes their views. They become resentful of Romania, which sometimes pushes them into the arms of pro-Russian groups and the pro-Russian narrative. These are basically the two main reasons, or the two main groups of people. If we look at the age range, of course, mostly older people declare sympathy towards Russia. There is also some kind of post-Soviet sentiment. But among young people, especially if they're Russian speakers, we can find people with pro-Russian views. This is not uncommon among ethnic minorities in Moldova.
And this is happening despite history. The Russians also committed crimes here. One of them was mass deportations. A total of up to about 90,000 Moldovans were forcibly deported by the USSR in 1940. In addition, as a result of forced collectivization, Moldova suffered a famine in 1946. Up to 115,000 people lost their lives. For years, these crimes were passed over in silence by the communist authorities. The situation changed only in the 1990s, and this was one of the catalysts for change. To discuss this, we go to an exhibition on the deportations that stands in the center of Chișinău.
In '89, in this place, in the nearby here, the monument of Stephen the Great, in '89, the first time in public space, the people protesting against the regime also said about the politics of history, as it's called now, yes. The first time in public space, in this area, in this country, people talked about Stalinist deportations, they call them, about the famine, post-famine, about the mass executions in Moldovan Autonomous Republic in the late 80s, the Great Terror, which covered also people of Polish nationality. So this politics of memory changed in '89, '90, before the fall of the Soviet Union. It's very important to say that delegitimized the Soviet regime in general, that created the ideological, if you want, basis for the declaration of independence of Moldova.
Today, knowledge of Russian crimes is more widespread. Most Moldovans have no illusions about the criminal nature of the USSR and the continuity between Russia and the Soviet Union. However, there is still, as we said, a pro-Russian electorate. Why is that? Part of the answer may lie in Russia's superbly organized propaganda machine.
So the most important channel of Russian propaganda here are the agents of influence, either politicians, bloggers, vloggers, political commentators, and they are present everywhere. So first of all, they use people, they use these voices which amplify all the narratives of their propaganda. And they're present everywhere. In independent pro-European media, you still have to make news and to present what one politician or another said. So it is an amplifier. Social media, of course, is a very important amplifier. And there are some really wild spaces where people just can say any fake, any distorted conspiracy, doesn't matter, like TikTok. And we see very clear how allegedly independent speakers just repeat very specific narratives of Russian propaganda, which means that these people are paid to do it. Other media such as Facebook, YouTube is full of Russian propaganda. More than it, pro-Russian oligarchs and politicians are using money to sponsor this content. And it's full on YouTube, it's full on Facebook, on Instagram. So they are quite present, and just kind of cutting and banning is not a solution at all. Especially having in mind that the big tech platforms do not pay serious attention to Moldova and to prevention of disinfo spread in this area.
Since several TV channels retransmitting Russian propaganda were discontinued, this has moved to other media. Today, even elderly people use the internet. In their home, there is a TV hanging on the wall connected to YouTube. And there, we have the same message available to us as before, even if you don't actively use Telegram or other social media. Where this propaganda is also present, all you have to do is turn on YouTube. You only need to select a certain type of material there once, and the algorithm will advise you about further similar videos to watch. People who are used to receiving information in the form that Russian propaganda provides them find ways to continue to be influenced by this drug themselves. This could be social media, or it could even be the YouTube installed on the TV. However, Russia's influence on Moldova is declining. An example is energy policy. Until 2021, Moldova was completely dependent on Russian gas. Today, the situation is different.
Już inna, w tej chwili Mołdawia 100% swojego własnego zapotrzebowania na gaz pokrywa ze źródeł.
At the moment, Moldova covers 100% of its own gas needs from non-Russian sources, simply buying this raw material on European exchanges. The situation is a bit more complicated on the electro-energy issue. Moldova does not have the capacity to produce enough electricity for its needs, only managing around 20 to 30%. It needs to obtain the rest from other sources. One of these traditional sources, which just happens not to be used at the moment, is the Moldovan Gres power plant. This is a power plant located in Transnistria, de facto owned by the Russian electricity company RAO-UES. This power plant supplied most of the electricity for right bank Moldova, or Moldova proper, until recently. Now it does not. The missing 80–70% comes from the west, from Romania, from which Moldova imports electricity. Moldova can also partly import electricity from Ukrainian territory, although at the moment this is hampered by the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian conflict and regular shelling of Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Nevertheless, it can be stated that Moldova is not dependent on Russian gas supplies, and in principle is not dependent on Russian electricity supplies either, as it is able to secure supplies of this good for itself from other sources. The only problem is that the gas and electricity flowing to Moldova until recently from Transnistria was clearly cheaper than what Moldova has to obtain at the moment, for example from Romania or other Western partners, which is a bit of a problem, especially from the political point of view, because the political elites have to explain to their electorate why gas and electricity bills have suddenly gone up.
Russia's influence is also declining in separatist Transnistria, as we learned from the Deputy Prime Minister of Moldova, responsible for the issue of reintegration with Transnistria.
I think the Russian influence in Transnistria is less important than used to be, definitely. Transnistria is an enclave between the rest of Moldova and Ukraine, without open access to the sea, so it's totally enclavated. That's why the dependence on both Kiev and Chisinau is huge. So I think now we have more instruments to work with Tiraspol or Kiev than Moscow. So the most important tool for the Russians is the Russian military presence there. Indeed, despite the fact that, as I mentioned, the majority of the soldiers are from the region, but anyway, the command is Russian.
In addition to the military, gas was another tool of Russia's influence on Transnistria, but that ended on January 1st, 2025. That's when Russian gas stopped flowing through Ukraine.
Przez pierwszy miesiąc, przez cały styczeń de facto, Naddniestrze w związku z tym w ogóle...
For the first month, for the whole of January, Transnistria did not de facto receive gas at all, which caused a rather serious crisis in this parastate. There was no heating, in any case no gas heating. People heated themselves with electricity, which the Moldovan Gres power plant generated on an emergency basis from coal it had stored there, because, of course, Transnistria has no coal reserves of its own to extract. The whole industry came to a standstill because there was no gas supply. At the moment, the situation is a bit more complex. Gas to Transnistria is supplied from the west through a Hungarian-Dubai conglomerate. This gas is paid for by the Russian Federation, but the amounts of this gas supplied to Transnistria are small. It is half of what Transnistria normally needs, and as a result, this gas is not enough to fully run the local economy. People are not freezing there. They can fuel their apartments. They can use the gas for their cooking needs. They can heat their offices and smaller businesses. But the big industrial plants that belong either to the so-called Transnistrian state treasury or to the Sheriff Corporation, which de facto rules and exercises power in the region, they can't function. Well, because they simply don't have enough fuel. And the reason they don't have it is because Moldova won't agree to supply more and to restart this heavy economy, on the assumption that this is de facto supporting the separatist regime.
Vadim Krasnoselsky, the leader of Transnistria, spoke about this gas crisis. Yes, we are receiving gas thanks to the support of the Russian Federation. Moldova is not currently in any way blocking supplies. However, the agreements are short-term. Their technical preparation requires time and significant effort from the participants. We must conserve resources to avoid falling again into a deep energy crisis. We are making every effort to prevent this from happening again.
Moldovans don't want a humanitarian catastrophe to happen. They don't want the residents of Transnistria to suffer, and that's why they allow gas supplies in sufficient quantities for the residents and small business. But at the same time, they don't want to fund the Transnistrian authorities and the Sheriff Corporation.
Many people think that this can open the way to the integration and reintegration of Moldova with Transnistria.
There is a window of opportunity, definitely, and everybody's seen it. In Tiraspol, in Chisinau, in Vienna, or other capitals which are involved in the negotiation process. But we should use this opportunity carefully. Moldova has a fragile economy, fragile internal political situation.
I think we have now a window of opportunity to settle peacefully this 30 years old conflict. It's gonna be quite a difficult task. I think the main example that we should analyze is the reunification of Germany, East and West Germany, that took place more than 30 years ago. And there are lessons to learn from there. And we should analyze every area step by step. I mean, energy sector, financial sector, political, voting rights, media, ownership rights, legislation.
Reintegration, however, comes with its risks and problems.
Например, самое простое. На левом берегу около 140 тысяч пенсионеров.
We are not ready to take on these 140,000 more pensioners. On top of this, another question arises. How are we going to pay the salaries of the retired employees of the Transnistrian security service structures? And we're not even talking about vetting these people. And after all, the reintegration of the country is about not allowing people with a Homo Sovieticus mentality to be elected to state positions. All this means is that we are not taking the subject seriously.
Это значит, что мы, так сказать, просто несерьезно относимся к этой проблеме.
This is an excerpt from the Victory Day celebrations in Transnistria and a statement of one of its participants. I came here to remember my ancestors, who fought so that we could have a peaceful sky above our heads and that all would be well.
I think the biggest challenge would be to find human resources that would be willing to go to the Transnistrian side to implement legislation, to work in public services, in police, in courts, in prosecution office, in universities, schools, and so on and so forth. To find people who would be willing to go there. And this was a problem for Germany as well, because they tried to pay slightly higher salaries for those who want to work in the East Germany. And still, after more than 30 years, there are issues to be solved. So it's a long path, but we should start working on this reintegration plan. The government is working, but one of the priorities, probably the main priority for us, is to implement the EU integration agenda. This is probably more important because, after all, in order to speed up this reintegration process, we need to make Moldova much more interesting from the point of view of standards of living for the people who live in Transnistrian region. If they will see that Moldova is doing much better, the salaries are higher, the quality of life is better, they would be more eager to reunite with Moldova.
Therefore, it's extremely important for Moldova not only to reintegrate with Transnistria, but also, and perhaps above all, to integrate with the European Union. And this is where the question arises of the geopolitical direction in which Chișinău will be heading. This is Maia Sandu. She has been president since 2020. Her election was the first signal of pro-Western changes in Moldova. Shortly after Sandu's victory, her PAS party took power. Since then, Moldova's policy has been unequivocally pro-European, and this does not please the Kremlin. Chișinău's success in European integration could be dangerous for Putin, and that is why Russia is putting forward its biggest weapon to combat Maia Sandu. That weapon is stoking fear.
Россия продвигает идею, что Майя Санду ведет...
Russia is peddling the thesis that Maia Sandu is leading Moldova towards a Ukrainian scenario, that she is preparing Moldova for war with Russia. This propaganda is probably calculated for those who have never seen a map, but there are unfortunately many people on whom it works. Moscow also claims, for example, that EU accession means NATO membership. This is how they are building up a sense of fear in society, and fear is the most effective instrument for turning people into a herd, and Putin's propaganda tries to use this tool.
Sandu again won the elections in 2024. However, the more important parliamentary elections are still ahead of us and will take place in the autumn.
It is in these elections that the PAS party, the ruling party, the Party of Action of Solidarity, a pro-Western party, will fight to once again win a majority that will enable them to continue their reforms and to continue the process of European integration and negotiations with the European Union. The problem is that almost certainly PAS will not be able to repeat its success of 2021 when it won this independent majority.
The authority of the pro-Western party PAS has worn off, and this is clear in the polls.
PAS does not currently enjoy as much political support as it did in 2021 for a number of reasons. First of all, the country's economic situation is not the best, to put it mildly. Moldova has been on the verge of a de facto recession for 2 years. The economy is stagnant, growth is minimal or virtually non-existent. The inflation that hit Moldova between 2022 and 2023 was very high, reaching over 30%, which was felt and reflected in the wallets of Moldovans. Electricity prices and gas prices due to the outbreak of the Russian-Ukrainian war, due to Russian actions, increased sometimes even several times, and from the perspective of the voters, even those who realize that this is not the direct fault of the government, but of the international situation and Russian policy, well, there is a deterioration of living conditions, and people traditionally blame the government for this. Moreover, PAS has so far failed to deliver on the key promises it made in 2021. Some might think that PAS went into the elections primarily as a pro-European party, promising European integration, but this is not true. PAS, when it won the elections in 2021, presented itself primarily as an anti-oligarchic and anti-corruption party, a grouping that would reform the judiciary, that would fight all these structures created by the oligarchs, that would improve the quality of life of Moldovans, that would bring about an increase in their salaries, an increase in pensions, and so on. that it would continue or lead and accelerate the process of European integration. But this European integration was a completely side topic. In the end, however, quite the opposite happened. PAS has been very successful in European integration. Moldova is a candidate for accession negotiations, which I don't think anyone dreamt of back in 2021. But it has not reformed the judiciary. It has failed to improve the economic situation. People are de facto no better off than they were before, and the pensions that PAS promised to raise and actually delivered shortly after coming to power were consumed by inflation that was over 30%. The most painful problem really is the issue of the judiciary, which has been, for years, painstakingly reformed. These reforms have been accompanied by many scandals and conflicts of the ruling party itself, which does not improve the government's image, and which makes, well, a certain part of the electorate, even the pro-Western one, simply feel disappointed.
Russia has already managed to reverse one country from the pro-Western path of reform. That country is Georgia. Now, the Kremlin would certainly like to do it again.
Поэтому вот такой условно-грузинский сценарий.
Such a Georgian scenario is entirely possible. We are in the midst of a hybrid war, and there will be big money flowing into Moldova for the parliamentary campaign. Dirty money. We have already seen this during the local elections. Never before have we seen such large resources involved. Votes were simply being bought. This was done in Gagauzia and wherever Shore activists were active. This is why this is a danger. It is possible because a part of the population, especially representatives of so-called socially sensitive groups, live very modestly, if not to say poorly. Admittedly, these people are not starving, but nevertheless, when someone offers them cash for casting a vote a certain way, their choice is obvious.
And there are many indicators that this election could decide the direction in which Moldova will go.
Wydaje się, że Mołdawia pozostanie państwem.
It seems that Moldova will remain, at least nominally, a pro-European state, no matter what. There is no majority in Moldova at the moment that can force in a pro-Russian government, or one that would advocate unequivocally a course towards deep cooperation with Russia. The problem is different. The problem and fear in Moldova is a repetition of the so-called Georgian scenario. That is, the coming to power of politicians, groups or coalitions that would talk about European integration, that would declare a desire to deepen this integration, but at the same time would consciously undermine or slow down this process, or would put on the agenda subjects that would be unacceptable to partners in the European Union, and that would slow down or block the process of European integration. We are talking about, in addition to the rights of sexual minorities, issues concerning the operation of NGOs. For example, if representatives of the so-called centre in Moldova, such as the political bloc Alternative, came to power or co-governed, we could expect an attempt to push through a law on foreign agents, very similar to the one adopted in Georgia or previously adopted in Russia, in order to limit the functioning of NGOs in a certain way. This would obviously meet with opposition from Brussels. It would certainly have a negative impact on the European integration process, which is going very well at the moment. So, formally, European integration in Moldova will continue, no matter what. However, whether or not this will actually happen will depend on the September parliamentary election results in Moldova and what the future majority, possibly the future coalition, will look like.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, take a look at our other stories on screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.